Hello everyone, it's Clive Swansbourne here. Welcome to Piano Insights. Today we're going to be looking at Mozart's Piano Sonata in C, K.330. This piece has always been one of my favourite Mozart sonatas. I've always found it very delightful. It's not a difficult piece technically, and in fact I think it's a very good way to get intermediate players into the style of Mozart without having a great many technical problems to deal with. It is perfect in every way. I mean, Mozart chooses a very narrow range of expression, and he chooses a very narrow range of dynamics and range of actual size of the piece. It's a short piece. It's only a few minutes long, really. The three movements are all fairly short. And so it encapsulates a lot of what we need to know if we're going to play Mozart's music. It's kind of an encyclopedia, almost, of the phrasings and the articulations, the dynamic manipulations and so forth that we're going to find in all of Mozart's music, and we can master them all in one short piece. Except for technical, very highly technical difficulties, which are not. I'm talking about stylistic things now. So it's important to get the stylistic things absolutely right here. We don't have the leeway that we have in Bach, where we can very often choose our ornamentation, our articulations. In Bach, you can have two performances of a piece, one played staccato and one played legato, and they can be equally compelling as long as they're well done. Usually a mixture of the two, obviously, and usually a method of playing with regards to the expressive outcome is going to be the one which is going to be the most convincing. So we can't just sort of say, I'm playing this legato because that's what I've chosen to do. There's got to be a convincing case for it. And so Bach in many ways your hand is not being held at all. So in many ways, in terms of creativity, you can really lay it all out. You can say, I've really thought this out and this is what I've decided on. This is what I'm going to stamp this music with my own decision about articulation. You can't do that with Mozart. If you encounter a phrase in Mozart which goes like this, and you play it like this, you're simply doing it wrong. You're doing Mozart no justice at all, because that's not what he intends at all. And he often marks slurs, even though it has already become a hallmark of his style. It shouldn't be necessary to say this is how to do it. It's an expressive slur of two notes. Usually going down means that it's on a sort of a sad note, and therefore the second note has to be quieter. Otherwise it makes no sense at all. But he's quite active with his articulation advice in this piece. We have a lot of slurs and a lot of staccato marks, which later on in his life, in his later sonatas, he often doesn't do. It seems like the earlier the sonata is, the more advice he gives us how to play it, both in dynamics and in articulation. And then later on, you're kind of on your own more. You have to sort of apply the lessons you've learned in the earlier sonatas to the later ones. So, starting off with the very opening, there's obviously a fairly happy piece, fairly sunlit piece, like Mozart most often is. In fact, very few pieces in the minor key by Mozart, even though the minor key ones have become the most popular and famous on the whole. It wasn't his usual mood. His usual mood was happy. That's it, the first subject to the piece. You see how compact it is. It has a few very attractive ideas, and then he strings them together. And a lot of them are repeated. You get... and then... And usually I would say that, without overdoing it, when you get a repeated phrase like that, the second one should be played slightly differently. It's just more interesting. the thing to do is to make sure you don't play it too much differently and you don't draw attention to the fact. So everything is very subtle here. We get dynamic markings. Actually, in this edition, we get them in very small print. So because they only appeared in the first edition of the composition rather than in the manuscript. We do get large ones that were in the manuscript as well, but there are comparatively few of those. So in terms of dynamic markings, he's not nearly as active in the manuscript as he was in the earlier sonatas, but these are sort of fairly typical of his dynamic markings. What we need to remember, though, is that we're playing on modern grands, and these were written for much smaller instruments with wood frames and with very much less dynamic range. And so the difference between piano and forte was not that great. And so we have to pretty much do the same on our pianos, not make a great difference. And the difference between this it's a different, more of lightness rather than dynamics. It's slightly lighter than I played here, and it's slightly softer, but it wasn't an echo. It wasn't like going... No, the first one and the second one, it's a little bit lighter, a little bit different. And then here, slightly different. If I played them absolutely the same, not so interesting. I lightened, it wasn't so much I did an echo effect, but I diminished slightly earlier. I mean here, no diminish, and then you can diminish a little bit to make it a little different, to make it sound sort of subservient. This is not subservient, but it's kind of, it's a plagal cadence. And when you get a plagal cadence, usually the first chord, I would say usually, and it's not always the case, but I feel in this case, the plagal cadence, which is the movement from F major to C major, is one which softens us towards C major rather than which makes the C major just as bright. Now the treatment of, I've heard people do this, which I think spoils it to have pretty pedal at the beginning there. Mozart specifically marks short, long. And if you do, you get long, long. I mean, you get two identical notes, which he obviously doesn't want. Now the trill itself, I think should come without a Nachschlag. Now a Nachschlag is where you get a trill. Now if you were just going, it would sound good to add the Nachschlag, so you don't get just... You need the prettier, more elegant little tail at the end. But in this case, I think it sort of clouds the theme. It makes it too fussy. It actually sounds like part of the melody. It spoils it. For me, it spoils it. It makes it, the Nachschlag, sound like a melodic element, which it shouldn't ever sound. It should just sound like an elegant end to a trill. So I get rid of the Nachschlag in this one, and I sort of stop the trill for a split second. Now here again, you can either start on the upper note or the main note. This is on the upper note. This is on the main note. Either is fine, I think. Now later on we get, in this case, I don't think is, if you start on the upper note, you've just played that note and you're repeating it again. So you can't really hear the... I'm slowing it down. So this becomes the note of the trill, which starts on the actual note rather than on the note above it. You keep the skeleton, which is that, as opposed to, it sounds more mechanical. You're starting on the same note. It sounds like it's jarring the melody somewhat. So this is where I think we can ignore the so-called rules, which are that you should start trills on the upper note, not on the actual note, but the note above the trill is where you should start the trill. I think that's not always the case at all, and there are numerous occasions in this piece where I would say no, start it on the actual note. It's much more melodic, makes much more musical sense, and I'm pretty sure that these rules were meant to be broken, and there are a lot of rules about ornamentation and so forth which are guidelines. They're not really rules, I don't think. I'm sure Bach and Mozart ornamented things as a case required, and every case is musically different. It's just not a musical thing to just make a rule and stick to it under all circumstances. I suspect that was their philosophy too. So now we get these quite assertive scales. Now these shouldn't be too short, I don't think, but more. More. Well, actually, you can hear the melodic aspect of that more than you can if you just went. It's too bouncy and too sort of jovial. Okay, and then we get this more serious phrase. Now here, we get that phrase a little later actually, where it goes. It's interesting that we have the same idea there, and this is the end of the first subject here. Now, just because I'm used to it, I play these before the beat. I don't know whether that's correct or not, or whether Mozart would have done it or not. I just like it. I mean, so I don't really worry too much about that. I'm not a rule-bound sort of thinker, really. When I hear someone do that, it sounds very Mozartian. It doesn't spot it. In fact, it sort of is a very warm way of doing it, I think. Because you've got plenty of them which start on the beat. The next one starts on the beat. And then the one after that also starts on the beat. But more important than that is the fact that we should have a slightly different sound here. This is very bright in the beginning. Oh, by the way, it's really nice to try and bring out these whenever you get a movement in the left hand. Rather than doing that, you can bring out that little melodic element. Not loud, but if people have heard this enough times and they hear you doing that, they'll think, oh, that was nice. These very subtle things. Okay, so here we shouldn't have the same chirpy brightness. It's more. Not so much. If it's the same, it doesn't sound as interesting. We're in slightly more muted territory here. There's another version of a rule that we should break. It shouldn't be. I think it never makes any sense to me. This is obviously the important notes. Now here's a trill which also I think should be on not, which sounds fussy to me. That sounds more melodic and it makes more sense to me. Now this is marked forte, and this it reminds me of toy soldier music. This is sort of like a trumpet call. This is like the sergeant. I think of two figures here, like in a Marriage of Figaro, which is an opera from a few years later, and the scene where the page boy Cherubino is being put through his paces by Figaro. He's fallen in love with too many ladies in the castle, and Figaro's decided to take matters into hand and send him to the army. He's only 17, poor old Cherubino. But anyway, he's marched up and down by Figaro, and he's hating it. This is Figaro. Get on and march, and then this is him. Sort of quivering and shaking and not wanting to do it. And then... and this is him escaping. But not without a sigh of anxiety, you know. This is actually a very interesting chord, because it's the first chord in the whole piece which isn't a major triad. It's a diminished triad. I mean, there are some dominant sevenths. There's this one, which is a dominant seventh. But we haven't had a minor chord or a diminished chord yet. So this is a very important chord. And it goes to a minor chord. 2 minor chords in a row. But it comes out in the sunlight there. So it's a little dark spot, and it doesn't take much for him to create that slight change in mood there. I talk about military, you know, toy soldiers and Figaro here, because I think that it helps to characterize this music. All we get here is these P and then F, then P and then F. But if we think of a sergeant major bossing his cadet around, you know, and making him march and so on, it's more fun to play. It's more fun to imagine. And then maybe him sort of in fear for his new military life, and then saying, what the hey, I'll get out of it somehow, which is exactly what he does. Now, this is a very interesting subject here, because he starts off with a sforzando, and then he's already soft on the 3rd note. It's like a yodel almost, you know. It's not, which you'd expect it to be high on there. But this one is soft, you see, so it's more of a sort of chuckle. It's a laugh almost. Sort of a lightness on that one. That's another one where I think the trill is better on the beat. And you just count 6 notes. Tiggly-diggly-da. And then 4 sforzando on both of those notes. Now he marks all of these staccato. These, with the crescendo, they thicken. The staccatos get longer because they're 8th note staccatos, not 16th, and they thicken at the crescendo. And this is pure happiness, this part. Now you can do, on the second time around, you can maybe do an echo effect. Something different. You could do that. It wouldn't matter if you didn't or if you did. As long as you do something where you're actually making a case for it, characterizing it in the way that has convinced you and you're attempting to convince your listener. Just don't overdo it. A lot of these things are very subtle and have to be done with taste and with discretion. We get this military kind of style of music. And certainly, that's the scene from Figaro. It's very military style music here. So, and this is very cute and submissive almost. Now, after this, that's the exposition. We move into the so-called development section, in which Mozart doesn't develop anything, which is typical of Mozart actually. He liked to, very often, instead of developing, introduce new material, new ideas. And what he develops here is the emotional range of the piece. We have the only really minor key music here. We have chromaticism, thoughtful, introspective music. And we need a different colour at the beginning here. It's like one of the characters has gone into her parlour to think about her fate or something. Even that change from here to here, it's all very chromatic and it slides down in a very sad, almost sad way. Do it, but I mean it's definitely happier all of a sudden. I better get out of that mood. Tries to be chirpy. But we're back in the introspection now, in minor key for the first time. Stay in the minor key, but it keeps shifting key along here. In this so-called development section. You have to choose a different palette from that, you see, and you've got the very highly chromatic descents here. The first time, I think it's the first time pianissimo is marked here. And then we have a different version of here. You got two different variations on that descending thing, each one a little livelier, so don't be too chirpy too soon. No, you can't do that, it sounds ridiculous. You've come out of still very short on the, I mean very long on the short notes. Not staccato, you see. Definitely avoid staccato. And then he leads us back into the recapitulation. He starts to decorate himself instead of going. He does. And I think you can decorate too if you want. For example, what I like to do in this next part, instead of going, what I do is, I think it's fun to do that, and it's certainly allowable. We know that these composers did that all the time, and they don't spell it out for us. Bach didn't spell it out, except in one of two cases, like one of the sarabans, where he marks the kind of ornamentation that he used on the repeat. He doesn't say this is the ornamentation you have to use. Obviously, it's a guideline. You can use that decoration if you want, and we know that Mozart did the same thing. Improvisation was still very much part of the culture at that time. And so it's almost impossible to think that he would have just stuck to his score. Now, the very end of this is very beautiful because he brings back the music from the beginning of the second of the development section, and he brings that back at the very end of the piece in C major, in the brighter key, and it's a wonderful transformation of it. So I'll just play the end here. Well, that's the first movement of the Mozart. I shall be discussing the other movements in future videos. I thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you in future videos, and I would like very much if you would subscribe and like and share. Bye-bye.